I speak, I should say, with the accumulated expertise and knowledge of 7 weeks in the job, so I hope the committee will aim off a little bit for my inexperience. But, well, I'm not sure that's quite right, actually, Rose. The terms are, it slightly depends on whether people come forward in good faith and whether they are, as it were, undertake not to do this thing again, and some people have, as it were, but very broadly speaking, that as I've said, if people cannot pay, they will not be pursued past the point where they can't pay. I don't think the revenue has made anyone bankrupt as a result of the loan charge so far. That may in due course come.
May I just ask on that point about closed tax years, will that be applied retrospectively to people who've already settled?
I don't know the answer to that question. Okay. I think let me just think it through. I think what I said was that where you had a person who was that in some of these cases it was impossible not to be moved by some of the specific facts. Now I can't comment on the facts of a situation, and that may well be the case, and that something like 75% of the money will have come from employers and 15% from individuals. Now, it's very hard to see how a survey of mental health would actually be done, and so they have quite a sensitized understanding of the extent to which some of these may be the product of mental unhappiness or something of the kind. And as I've said, there are specific approaches within. And let me make the wider point the committee has also noted, which is that, of course, it is part of the function of the Treasury and HMRC, as you will know better than anyone, my Lord, to preserve the general taxpayer's interest against specific lobbies trying to, as it were, erode it. And in a way, that is part of what may be happening here. I'm not aware of any circumstance in which a public employer has paid via a disguised remuneration scheme, and I'm welcome to be corrected by members of the committee or others. I think you may not have caught. I don't think we agree about what Lord Forsyth was describing. The other thing I would say is that of the 50,000, it's precisely the point that the revenue, as it were, is not precisely sure who these people are. They have to come forward and self-identify as part of the loan charge process, and so getting what you might call a neutral basis on which to make a survey is, I think, rather difficult. At least certainly that's the impression I've had from talking to officials.
Maybe saying,
I hope it's perfectly clear that I've never said anything of the kind, Baroness Bowles.
But what I actually wanted to pursue was this mental health issue, and from the APPG we have got texts, evidence, and I understand that the HMRC have confirmed yesterday that the texts are genuine, of effectively daily harassment of individuals, asking them questions about their businesses and their personal lives, with the HMRC texter saying that she was a trained counsellor, forwarding the numbers for the Samaritans and even asking the Samaritans to call. And then when the person thinks of doing an IVA, dissuading them against that so that the HMRC can collect the money. Now, I think actually advising on whether or not you should do an IVA is financial advice, and I don't know whether the HMRC collectors are skilled financial advisors, and maybe the Financial Conduct Authority could have a look at that. So there is evidence that there is obviously some very severe pressure being put by HMRC, and probably severe pressure on the people who are having to do the collection in order to behave like that. I wouldn't find behaviour like that coming naturally. So how are these people being incentivised such that they will operate in such a way? Are there bonus schemes?
Now, you then raise the question of HMRC badgering and call that evidence. It may be evidence for something, but I don't think it's anything more than a one data point in a much bigger picture about what the status is. Not that it's unimportant, it's obviously very important, it may be deeply meaningful to the person concerned, and if it is true, of course it should be referred to the appropriate authority, and if there is malpractice or abuse, and this may be abusive behaviour by some public official, then they should be pursued for that. But I don't think it's evidence for, I think we would have to see a much wider suite of evidence to believe it was evidence for a more generally oppressive approach. And a lot of the evidence that I've seen, equally anecdotal from talking to different things, looking at different cases, is that actually the revenue is bending over backwards to try to get better at improving the way it deals with taxpayers. And I think in part that's because of the work of this committee. I think it understands that the hot breath of Parliament is behind it, and it is concerned, its officials are very public-spirited individuals, are concerned that they may have overbalanced a little. Now, I can't comment on the compensation arrangements for officials at the revenue. Well, I don't think, I think I said I didn't think there was a rule. I didn't say I didn't know, so the question of finding out doesn't arise. But, as you will be aware, the revenue has sought quite vigorously to make clear what the rules are. Now, whether there is scope or requirement to promulgate further, as it were, regulation or, as it were, further direction within government itself about this is something I'd be very happy to take away and look at.
There does seem to be a fundamental injustice here, which has in part been created by the law which we passed and its retrospective nature.
If I may just pick up a couple of things. I don't actually think it is retrospective. I think it is retroactive. It goes back in the same.
Retroactive.
I mean, but the tragedies about this whole argument has been that the extreme aggression of fighting the loan charge has brought people who might have been much better advised to settle early into a position of hostility with the revenue, where the one thing that I think HMRC would like is for them to come forward and see if they can treat for them on a fair and sensible basis. And by the way, government has funded them quite extensively. I mean, my predecessors have written some very substantial cheques to the Treasury to try to manage the process of helping them to improve all of those. The answer to that is through processes of overall ministerial scrutiny.
What are you looking for?
Could we just, as it were, zero in a little bit more about what kind of enforcement you're talking about? It's very widespread. Do you mean enforcement of domestic tax evasion? Do you mean enforcement of international VAT carousel fraud? I mean, what kind of... Well, so thank you. So I'm looking for a whole... That's very helpful clarification. I'm looking for a whole raft of different things. So I am looking for, first of all, feedback on transparency, feedback on things like the customer service statistics. Well, thank you very much indeed, Baroness Bowles. Of course, you all understand that in the particular case of accelerated payment notices and following notices, this is way miles away removed from the experience of the vast preponderance of taxpayers. So we are not talking about the vast majority of taxpayers. We're talking about a very specific set of taxpayers. But I absolutely think that Lord Judge's intervention in that debate was extremely powerful. I watched the debate and I saw the intervention, and I have agreed with HMRC that they will take the suggestion that he made with seriousness and will revert through a proper consultation, internal discussions with the MOJ, to me if I'm in post, and certainly to the committee, with an analysis of how that concern can be addressed. It's obviously a foundational matter. I mean, I don't tell you, my father-in-law wrote a book on the rule of law. It's a foundational matter of the rule of law that no one should be judge and jury in their own cause, or judge in their own cause, and that goes back to the origins of natural law. You find it in Hobbes and the rest of it. Now, in the case, that's an extremely interesting question. I have not reflected deeply on what the criteria would be, but I would certainly expect to be involved in a consideration of what the response to Lord Judge's concern properly should be, and I would expect that to be one that was discussed within the Treasury. Well, I think I'm right in saying that it's a general feature of the tax code that the period of time you have to keep records for is not always the same as the period of time over which a piece of recovery may legally take place.
Well, I understand that it doesn't make much sense, does it?
What we've been talking about this afternoon, I think, has done quite a lot of damage to HMRC's reputation. So I appreciate that it's only a very small number of taxpayers who've been caught up in these processes.
Well, you go to the wider point. I think in some respects, HMRC, let's be perfectly clear, I think HMRC is one of the best taxing authorities in the world. It is absolutely jam-packed with high-quality, dedicated professionals, and I have an enormous respect for it. I had respect for it before I became ministerially responsible for it, to the extent any minister is responsible for it, and my respect has got greater. And I do also think that it's been, to some extent, the victim of some pretty orchestrated and energetic negative campaigning. And I've tried to distinguish in testimony today between, as it were, the deeper interest and some of the cases that grab the headlines for all the obvious and good reasons around the outside. Now, the point I would make is I think it's not the work of a single moment or a single set of decisions to rebuild. I think there has been a shift in the balance that I don't think is enormously helpful. I think HMRC is still very widely respected. It's still highly effective. If you look at the numbers, actually the levels of complaint over time are going down. If anything, the levels of resolution of concerns are, the public esteem is still very high. But I do think it's important for ministers, and I think it's absolutely right for the committee to have raised the possibility that, as it were, if we didn't act now, that potential basis of consent might be undermined. And so in talking about this Professional Standards Committee, in talking about more transparency, I haven't really talked about more transparency, but I will very happily write to the committee on that. In talking about the different forms of respect for the rule of law that we have done, Lord Judge, the personal information notices, and the rest of it, that's all part of a concerted attempt by me with HMRC and with other ministers to try to start to redress this balance. And the reason I'm here is because I feel very strongly that this committee is the right place, given the work it's done on powers, to bring those results and bring those ideas. And of course I will, as the chairman has asked, write to him, but I will also, as I've said, expect to be writing to colleagues and placing a statement to the House more widely that captures some of the detail on this, and which will be more publicly accessible, I think, as well.
I think the letter hopefully will cover that which I was seeking.
I don't know the answer to that question. Okay.